The square in front of the concert hall was already boiling. People pressed shoulder to shoulder, cameras raised, police lights cutting the dusk into sharp blue flashes. Sirens wailed just long enough to announce authority, then died. The sheriff didn't pull Johnny Cash aside. He walked straight up to him, took his wrist, and locked the cuffs on in full view of the crowd. For a split second, everyone leaned in, waiting for the explosion they thought they knew by heart. The angry words, the shove, the collapse of another troubled star. It didn't come. Cash looked at the metal around his wrists, then at the faces staring back at him. He smiled, not wide, not playful, but calm enough to unsettle the moment. He leaned closer to the sheriff and said something quietly, something the microphones didn't catch. The sheriff froze, just for a beat, long enough for the crowd to sense that the script had slipped. No shouting followed, no resistance, only an uncomfortable silence spreading through hundreds of people who suddenly weren't sure what they were watching anymore. Days later, the newspapers would tell this story differently than expected. Not as another Johnny Cash disaster, not as a warning, but as the moment when a man everyone thought they understood stopped playing the role assigned to him and became something harder to dismiss. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The street outside the hall was already tight with people when the patrol car pulled in sideways and cut the lane in half. It wasn't dramatic at first. No siren, no shouted commands. Just the sound of brakes, the low click of a door opening, and a uniform stepping into a late afternoon that smelled of dust, gasoline, and sweat. Johnny Cash stood near the curb, coat hanging loose on his shoulders, dark hair pressed flat from the drive. He had been on the road too long. That showed first. Not the fame, not the posture, just the fatigue that settles behind the eyes when sleep stops meaning rest. A few fans hovered at a distance, unsure whether to approach. Someone held a folded program like a shield. The sheriff didn't motion him aside, didn't lower his voice. He read from a folded paper, loud enough for the words to travel. A prior violation. Conditions already explained. Substances mentioned without detail. The kind of language that turns a man into a file number while he's still standing there breathing. People expected noise. They always did. They leaned forward, waiting for a crack in the calm, a curse, a shove, anything that would justify the stares already fixed on him. Cash listened without interrupting. When the sheriff finished, there was a pause long enough for the wind to move through the line of parked cars. Then Cash nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if agreeing to a weather report. "All right," he said. His voice was rough but steady. "Let's do it clean." He turned, placed his hands behind his back on his own, wrists close together. The movement was so ordinary it broke the rhythm of the moment. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else stopped mid-breath. The sheriff hesitated, keys suspended in his hand, caught off script. "You don't have to make a show of it," the sheriff muttered. Cash looked over his shoulder, not smiling exactly, but not hard either. "I didn't," he said. "You did." The cuffs closed with a dry, metallic sound. It echoed more than it should have. No one spoke. Even the ones who had hoped for a scene felt the air thicken, as if something heavier than embarrassment had settled between them. A woman near the door crossed herself. A man in a suit glanced away, suddenly interested in his shoes. Cash stood there, wrists locked, not defiant, not crushed, just present. He cracked a small joke about saving the sheriff a seat if the show ran late. It wasn't funny. That was the point. It drained the tension instead of feeding it. For a second, the sheriff lost control of the crowd simply because there was nothing left to control. No resistance, No collapse. Just a famous man being taken in plain sight, calm enough to make everyone else uneasy. As they guided him toward the car, Cash glanced once at the venue behind him. Lights were coming on inside. Sound check would be waiting. A schedule already slipping out of reach. This wasn't a spectacle. It was a line being crossed in daylight. And everyone there understood, without saying it, that if this went wrong, it wouldn't end with a missed concert. The room behind the station desk was smaller than it needed to be. Bare walls, one window with a wire mesh pressed into the glass, a table scarred by old cigarette burns. No posters, no clock. The kind of place where time was something you felt rather than measured. The door shut. The sound landed heavy, final. Whatever had happened outside was gone now. No faces, no murmurs, no expectation of spectacle. Just two men and the paperwork between them. Cash sat straight-backed on a hard chair, hands resting on his knees now that the cuffs were off. Without the coat, without the street noise, he looked older. Not weaker, just stripped of distance. The black clothes no longer signaled an image. They were simply what he wore. The sheriff stayed standing. He didn't rush to speak. He studied Cash the way men do when they're trying to reconcile reputation with reality. Finally, he said quietly, "You know why this couldn't be handled somewhere else?" Cash nodded. "I do." That was it. No defense, no complaint. The absence of argument unsettled the sheriff more than shouting would have. He took a seat, folded his hands, and leaned forward. "I heard you once," he said. "Didn't plan to. My sister dragged me along. Prison show. Said I ought to hear what my boy listens to." Cash looked up, surprised despite himself. "She wrote me after," the sheriff continued. "Said you didn't sing at them. Said you talked like you were sitting where they were." Cash exhaled slowly. "That's because I could have been." The sheriff shook his head. "That's not how it works." "No," Cash said. "It's how it feels." Silence crept back in. Not hostile. Waited. The sheriff flipped a page, then stopped. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. "You've had chances most men in this county won't ever see, and you keep stepping right up to the edge." He paused. "That's what disappoints me." Cash didn't look away. "I disappoint myself too," he said. "I'm not confused about that." The admission landed harder than an excuse would have. The sheriff searched his face, waiting for the pivot, the plea, the name drop, the familiar machinery of influence. Instead, Cash leaned forward an inch. "I'm not asking you to forget this," he said, "or soften it." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Then what are you asking?" Cash chose his words carefully, like someone laying cards face up with no spares hidden. "Let me face it straight. No favors, no quiet calls. Whatever this costs, I pay it, publicly." "That's a bad idea," the sheriff said at once. "I know. You've got people who make problems disappear." "That's the problem," Cash replied. "They disappear. I don't." The sheriff leaned back, unsettled now. This wasn't defiance. It was something riskier. Ownership. "If I walk out of here like nothing happened," Cash went on, "everything I ever sang about becomes a lie I got paid for." The room felt tighter. The sheriff stared at the table, then back at the man across from him. "You understand," he said slowly, "that this doesn't put you ahead." Cash nodded. "I'm not trying to get ahead." He was trying to change the direction of the fall. The cell wasn't meant for sleeping. The bench was too narrow, the light too sharp, the air carrying the stale trace of men who had waited there before him. Somewhere down the hall, a door clanged shut and stayed that way. After that, the building settled into a low mechanical breathing, pipes, distant radios, footsteps that never quite arrived. Cash sat with his back against the wall, boots flat on the floor. He didn't lie down. Lying down felt like pretending this was temporary. He needed to stay awake long enough to understand what was happening to him without anyone else explaining it. This was not the first time he had been alone with consequences, but it was the first time no one was rushing in to manage them. No manager hovering with a phone pressed to his ear. No lawyer murmuring strategies. Just the weight of a choice already made and another one waiting. He thought of Arkansas nights, the kind that go quiet all at once, when the cicadas stop and the dark feels deliberate. He thought of his mother's voice, steady even when money wasn't. Of the Air Force years, learning discipline the hard way, learning how easy it was to lose yourself when the rules ran out. Of the first recording sessions, cheap studios, the belief that a song could keep a man honest if he sang it straight enough. Faces surfaced uninvited. Men in prison yards, leaning forward when he spoke between songs, listening not like fans but like witnesses. He had never sung to impress them. That was why they listened. Another scandal would finish him. Not loudly, quietly. Doors closing without explanation. Invitations that never came. He understood that now with a clarity that hurt more than fear. The fall wouldn't be sudden. It would be orderly. A guard passed by, glanced in, moved on. No comment, no judgment, just routine. Cash reached into his pocket and found a scrap of paper, creased and soft from being folded too many times. He borrowed a pencil from the desk when the guard wasn't looking. He didn't write lyrics. Music felt like evasion tonight. Instead, he wrote a few plain lines, block letters, no rhythm to hide behind. A promise that wasn't meant for anyone else. No forgiveness asked for, no future claimed. When footsteps echoed again, closer this time, he folded the paper carefully and slipped it back where it belonged. He knew there were calls that could be made before morning, names that still carried weight, offers that would come dressed as help. For the first time, he let them pass unanswered in his head. Not out of pride, out of necessity. If he reached for them now, the night would have been wasted. The light never dimmed. He watched it hum, waiting for dawn not with hope, but with readiness. By the time the sky outside the narrow window shifted from black to gray, Cash had already decided what he would accept, and what he wouldn't trade his name for again. Morning arrived without ceremony. No sunrise through bars, no moment that felt earned. Just a change in the quality of light, flatter and less forgiving, seeping into corridors that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. Cash was released into a narrow office where forms were already waiting. The language was precise, restrained. A fine. Conditions reiterated. A record that would follow him whether anyone mentioned it or not. No speech about lessons learned. No handshake. The transaction was handled the way institutions prefer their authority. Efficient and impersonal. By noon, he was sitting in a borrowed room at a motel just off the highway. Curtains half drawn. Phone on the nightstand, already warm from use. His name was moving faster than he was. The first call came from management. Calm voices, careful phrasing. This could be shaped, they said, redirected. A statement drafted by professionals who understood how these things played in print. Acknowledgement without admission. Concern without responsibility. Then the lawyer. Firmer tone. Silence would be interpreted, he warned. If you don't speak, others will. That never ends well. A third voice followed. Someone from the label. Friendly. Distant. He was advised to steady the situation, to protect the catalog, to think long-term. Cash listened. Thank them. said very little. What they wanted wasn't an apology. It was control. A version of events with softened edges and a clear exit ramp. Something clean enough for radio, brief enough for headlines. He declined. No statement, he said. No corrections. The line went quiet. Not shocked, concerned, as if he'd chosen the one option that wasn't on the board. You understand how that looks, someone said. I do, Cash replied. By the end of the day, the consequences arrived the way frost does, quietly, everywhere at once. A station in the Midwest postponed a scheduled interview. Another swapped out a record during an afternoon block. No explanation offered. It wasn't a ban. It was worse. It was discretion. An old ally sent a short message through an assistant. Regret. Bad timing. Best to let things cool. No need to involve names. Cash sat on the edge of the bed, jacket folded beside him, listening to the hum of traffic beyond the wall. Yesterday, there had been a crowd. Faces. Noise. Now there was space. Distance. The peculiar loneliness of being handled politely. He understood the irony. A public scandal would have kept him visible. A carefully worded confession would have reassured everyone who needed reassurance. Silence did neither. It left people uncertain, and uncertainty makes institutions nervous. For the first time since the arrest, doubt crept in. Not about the decision itself, but about the cost. This path didn't promise redemption. It didn't even promise survival. It simply refused to bargain. As night settled again, Cash realized something colder than fear. If he lost everything from here, it wouldn't be because of the cuffs or the charge. It would be because he chose not to explain himself. And he stayed with that choice, listening to the quiet spread. The restrictions were never written in bold. That was the clever part. On paper, nothing had changed. Permits were still valid. Venues were technically available. No authority issued a ban or signed their name to a refusal. Everything remained possible, just barely. Cash learned this the slow way. A call from a small civic hall ended with an apology that sounded rehearsed. A charity event stalled over logistical concerns. A prison program that had welcomed him before suddenly required additional reviews, additional signatures, additional time that no one could define. All of it was legal. All of it polite. He sat across from an organizer in a borrowed office one afternoon, the man's hands folded neatly on the desk. Regulations were cited. Insurance was mentioned. Safety, always safety. Each sentence arrived carefully scrubbed of intent. "You're not saying no," Cash said. The man offered a thin smile. "I'm saying it's complicated." That word followed him everywhere now. A week later, the sheriff reappeared. Not in uniform, not announced. He stood at the back of a meeting room while Cash listened to another explanation of why a planned appearance might not be advisable at this time. When their eyes met, neither man nodded. They spoke afterward, briefly, in the hallway. "You've stirred things up," the sheriff said. "I didn't say much," Cash replied. "That's what did it." The sheriff explained without defending it. The arrest had split opinions. Some thought the law had finally caught up. Others believed it had been used too publicly. No one wanted to be the one who chose wrong. So decisions were delayed, conditions added, responsibility diffused until nothing moved. Then the offer came. It was framed as a solution, reasonable on its surface. Cash could go forward with the performance if he acknowledged his mistake publicly. Not an apology, an affirmation, a short statement, approved wording, emphasis on regret and cooperation. Nothing dramatic, nothing personal. Control the narrative, they said. Close the loop. Cash asked for time. He walked alone that evening, past storefronts already closing, the town settling into routine without noticing him. He understood the trap clearly now. Accept the phrasing, and the doors would reopen. Refuse, and the stalemate would harden into exclusion. This wasn't about music or legality. It was about who got to define the meaning of what had happened. He thought of the note still folded in his pocket, of the silence he had chosen once already. When he returned, the answer was simple. "No statement," he said. "Not like that." The room didn't react. Pens paused. Faces remained neutral. That was how you knew the decision had consequences. As he left, Cash felt the ground thin beneath him. Not gone, not yet, but fragile. There were no winning angles left. Only the choice to stand where he was, knowing the next step might not be offered at all. They never said the show was forbidden. They said it wasn't recommended. That word carried weight, without leaving fingerprints. The facility sat outside town, low and square, surrounded by a fence that had seen better paint. Officially, the paperwork was in order. Unofficially, everyone involved understood this was a test. If it failed, no one would claim responsibility. If it worked, no one would admit they doubted it. Cash arrived without an entourage, no announcement, no warm-up act. The room wasn't built for acoustics. Sound bounced where it wanted, died where it shouldn't. Folding chairs filled the space, bolted down just enough to remind everyone where they were. The air smelled of concrete and old heat. A few men from local offices stood along the back wall, hands in pockets, expressions carefully neutral. They weren't there to enjoy themselves. They were there to observe. Cash walked on stage carrying his guitar like a tool, not a symbol. He didn't greet the room, didn't scan for familiar faces. He adjusted the strap, tested one chord, and began. Not a hit, not something friendly. A song that left little room to hide, about time, consequences, and the quiet arithmetic of regret. The words landed flat at first, then started to settle. No one clapped, no one shifted. The silence wasn't approval. It was attention. Between songs, he spoke once. "I won't explain myself," he said, voice low, even. "I'll just stand here and mean what I sing." Somewhere near the front, a man lowered his eyes. Along the wall, one of the observers crossed his arms tighter, as if bracing against something that couldn't be argued with. Cash mentioned the arrest without naming it. No details, no defense, just a sentence about carrying your mistakes where everyone can see them, and not asking anyone to carry them for you. The room held its breath. He played on. Each pause felt intentional. Each note sat exactly where he put it. This wasn't a performance built to win anyone back. It was a statement made without asking permission. When the last chord faded, there was no applause. None was expected. What followed was heavier, a shared stillness that refused to turn into relief. Cash nodded once, almost to himself, and stepped away from the microphone. As he left the stage, the men at the back didn't move. They exchanged looks they'd never describe later. The control they'd expected to exercise never arrived. The show ended the way it began, quietly. But the balance in the room had shifted, and everyone there knew it, whether they wanted to or not. The papers came out 2 mornings later. Not the kind that chase scandal with oversized type, but the ones that let a story breathe in columns meant for people who read slowly. The arrest appeared halfway down the page. No adjectives, no outrage, just a fact, now anchored to something larger. What followed surprised everyone. Instead of a collapse narrative, the pieces traced a line. Concerts played where they weren't expected, a refusal to smooth the edges, a man choosing to be accountable without performing remorse. The language wasn't flattering. It was careful. That was new. One headline mentioned restraint. Another used the word responsibility. None used disgrace. Radio hosts spoke about it in the gaps between records, uncertain how to frame what hadn't behaved like a crisis. A few stations quietly put his songs back into rotation, without comment, as if testing the temperature of the room. The audience didn't recoil. A reporter reached the sheriff for a statement. He kept it brief. "The law did what it's supposed to," he said. After that, the man did. That sentence traveled. Inside municipal offices, the tone shifted. Not in meetings, not officially. But the pressure eased. Permits moved again. Reviews stopped stalling. No one admitted a reversal because no one had admitted obstruction in the first place. Cash was offered interviews, big ones, redemption arcs. He declined most of them. When he finally agreed to appear publicly, it wasn't framed as a defense or a victory lap. He stood at a small lectern, no guitar, no backdrop, and spoke about men who lived their lives inside margins no one bothered to read. He didn't mention his name. He didn't mention the arrest. Listening to him, people understood something without being told. This wasn't a man demanding absolution. This was a man refusing to be reduced. Afterward, there were no encores, no crowd surge, just a few nods, a few quiet thank yous. Enough. That evening, Cash walked off stage alone. The hall emptied behind him in an orderly way, chairs scraping softly against the floor. Outside, the air was cool and unremarkable. No photographers waited. No police cars idled nearby. The story had moved past spectacle. In the weeks that followed, people spoke to him differently, more carefully. Not because they feared him, but because they weren't sure they could dismiss him anymore. The arrest remained part of the record. It always would, but it no longer defined the sentence. Cash understood then what had changed. Silence hadn't cleared his name. It had clarified it. He stepped into the dark without applause, carrying nothing extra. This time, the quiet followed him by choice, and it worked in his favor.